In modern culture, you wrote that for a society that's outlived its gods, there are three options, three paths.
Mm.
Firstly, to build a secular alternative to religion in the form of high culture.
Mm.
Secondly, to I suppose descend into outright barbarism, or thirdly, to fake the higher emotions which religion and high culture, enable us to have.
Right.
Could you explain what you mean by that third route of faking the higher emotions? And is that what you think our society has done?
Yes, I think that uh, all civilizations create this sense that there is an ideal form of life in which we're not just animals and not just pursuing our own interests, but relating to each other as spiritual beings, taking care of each other, committing ourselves to each other, and so on. I think we all recognise that. But in the past, this has always depended upon some shared religious faith, or at least something that has come down to us from religious faith. And my view is that we have improvised for quite for a century or so, thanks to our high culture, by which I mean literature, music, and painting, and all the rest, all the things that have perpetuated this ideal picture, and it's worn thin. And in order to face up to this, we have collectively, as it were, fallen into the habit of faking it. And that's what I was really writing about in that article for Eon. The idea that we're joined together to pretend and take ourselves in, to say that we really are feeling the deep and serious things, and agreeing with each other that that's what we're doing, even though underneath the kind of a measure of self-interest is taking things over.
Mm. So, and the idea of kitsch is quite central to this, isn't it?
Yes,
Do you think of
that
kitsch as kind of fake? Do you think of it as fake emotion or vulgar emotion, or could you explain a bit about the idea of kitsch?
yes. I think this is something that has puzzled me, and I think many people for a long time. We all have, all of us living now, that is, have an instinctive sense of what is kitsch and what isn't. You look at a Christmas card and you say, "Oh God, that's kitsch," but another Christmas card, you say, "Oh, that's rather beautiful." And same, of course, with art and music and all the rest. But it's very difficult to define it. If we look at history, the history of high culture, you'll very rapidly see that it's a very recent phenomenon. You can't find kitsch in medieval art or poetry. In fact, it seems to come in the wake of the Enlightenment. So there is a real question as to what it is and why. So I connect it with this collective need to fake things, to make a display of emotions that you don't really feel in order to gain credit for them without the cost. And out of that grows whole forms of art, which, as it were, titillate people and flatter them that they really are feeling things seriously, when in fact it's a game.
But what is there? I mean, could kitsch be confused with simply bad art? Like, say, a Richard Curtis film like Love Actually strikes
Yes.
me as quite cheesy and quite kitsch. But is that perhaps just bad art rather
Well,
than
you're
anything
right, but
more
of course,
sinister?
this is such a complicated phenomenon. You can't really assimilate everything to one category. There is, sheer incompetence in certain forms of art, but the word cheesy is quite a good one that you used there, because that is a very clear indication that right through the culture people are able to recognize this. People who don't have any very developed taste in musical films and so on will still make a very quick distinction between cheesy things and real things. And I think that is something we all feel.
And you also write very interestingly on the idea of fantasy and its difference to imagination in terms of how they educate our emotions.
Yeah.
So, could you tell me a bit about that, about what you see as the increasing role of fantasy in our
Yes.
culture?
Well, this is something which I think, again, people have picked up in recent times. I guess it was really Freud who first saw fantasy as a fundamental psychic device, a form of self-protection, that people engage in. And I think I'm giving a slightly different definition of it, but I would say there's a great difference between exercises of the imagination which are really directed towards understanding things and exercises which are directed towards escaping from them. And I think fantasy is the latter. It's the form where we, as it were, enter dream worlds which protect us from reality and make it and put it at a distance and don't help us to focus on it or to understand it. And in real art, especially tragic art, of the Shakespearean kind, you find something which is not fantasy at all, something which is bringing you face to face with some of the most disturbing facts about the human condition and getting you to live with them, accept them, and as it were, rearrange your emotional life to accommodate them. And that, I think, is a very important value of art, and it's why I think of fantasy as something fundamentally negative, in that it's destroying that ability we have to confront things.
So, and it's, I suppose, in something like a kind of vulgar war film like Rambo, and that kind of cheap wish fulfillment, or pornography. There's no what they lack is vulnerability, a sense of human vulnerability, and there's in the audience aren't really making themselves vulnerable either.
Well, that's a very good observation. That's part of it, certainly. But of course, there's something else. I mean, the case of pornography and the pornography of violence, this sort of constant dismembering of human beings that you see in the sort of Tarantino films and so on. There you have actually fantasy, which is also feeding a kind of vice, where people actually really they really want to look at these things, but haven't got the courage to look at the thing in reality.
Yeah. So, but I mean, are you saying then that high culture is necessary for people in a society in order to feel the higher emotions? Or let me put it another way: are you saying that a person today can't necessarily feel real grief when their child dies if they haven't, for example, seen King Lear?
If I said that, that would be pretty awful, wouldn't it? No, I think, of course, people feel the very basic things, just as they always did. Human nature is what it is. But there are different ways of feeling things, and when we're afflicted by a feeling, as in the case of grief, there is also a human need to articulate it, to share it, and to re-establish connection with the community. That's what, of course, religion does at these great moments, and it's what, for many people, poetry and music and art will do. But if you take away religion and take away high culture too, the feelings exist in their raw state, and as it were, it's like they become wounds which can never find a dressing.
And you quote in your book a nice quote by Matthew Arnold. I think, was it following the death of Tennyson, perhaps, where he said something like, "Who will let us feel?"
Yes, that's death of Wordsworth. Yeah. Yes.
But go on.
No. I mean, this is a very difficult area because it's very easy to sound incredibly snobbish, as though uneducated people can't have feelings. Of course, you don't want to say that. In many ways, they're more likely to have sincere and real feelings than the hyper sophisticated. But there is still the problem that feelings require something else. They require a resolution, and that's why culture in all its forms exists. It's there so that people can actually bear human life, and they bear it by uniting with others, by forming a cultural community in which people can give each other support.
And of course, looking at the example of King Lear, one of its strengths was it was an art form not just for the educated, but a large part of the audience would have been illiterate.
Of course, yes.
But is the situation so necessarily dire now? I mean, if one looks at our society now compared to, say, T.S. Eliot's in the 1920s, the general level of education is much higher. A far bigger percentage of the population has now access to high culture.
Yeah.
So are we really, in the dark ages now?
No, I wouldn't say that. I would dispute, though, that people are more educated now than in Eliot's day. I think
I mean a broader proportion of them.
Possibly. However, the school, I think it was the School Education Board in the 1890s, reported total literacy among children aged 11 in Britain, and they don't do that now. Anyway, let's not worry about that. I mean, that's a controversial political thing. But I would say that things aren't all bad. And the particular focus of my article was the way in which it is all distorted by the art establishment. There is real art and real music of a very serious kind being produced now, but it isn't the sort that gets the attention of fashion. There are whole schools of figurative painting, which I think are extremely important, especially in America. But the art schools go on producing sub-Hirschian drivel, and so I think that these one has to recognise that things get taken over by the fakers because they have the ability to pull the wool over people's eyes, and old-fashioned, modest, humble artists and composers and writers don't do that. So they get left out, pushed to the margins. But in fact, they might be just as vital and just as present in society as they always were.
Okay, I'm going to ask you shortly just about this idea of fake intellectuals and kind of good critics versus bad critics. I just wanted to ask you about your idea of high culture as a substitute for religion when we've lost our gods. And you put it very well that high culture in a way is like a cult in that one needs to be initiated into it. There is a rite of passage before one is within the cult. But it just struck me when I came across that idea that that shows the difference between high culture and Christianity, in that a cult is really just for the few. It's not for the masses, is it? Whilst Christianity was broader than that. It was both high and low. It was both for the philosopher and the ordinary people in the street. And the second difference I thought of between high culture and Christianity was that in high culture there's not necessarily the sense of good works and of charitable works, which is obviously as you know something that the critics of Matthew Arnold accused him of. And there's also the danger with high culture is that you get, as you put in your book, you get very focused on the signifier rather than the signified. You get very into the artwork rather than what the artwork is pointing at.
Yes.
And the final thing that I wondered whether it could be a genuine substitute to religion is that high culture seems to me quite solitary. You don't have that proper, actual, visceral community that one gets in church. You might go to a concert, but you go alone, and then you leave alone. You don't necessarily know the people you're there in the concert hall with. So those were just my kind of thoughts about the differences and maybe perhaps the inadequacies of high culture to replace something like Christianity.
Yes, I think you're right. Of course, it could never replace religion in that sense. But at the same time, what I wanted to say was that high cultures grow from religion. They are the reflective part of it, and then they take off and go in directions of their own. perpetuating something of the meaning and particularly the emotional meaning of the religious source, and making it still available even in days when the actual gift of faith has declined. But of course, you're right that a religion is by its nature available to everyone, or at least the religions that we know, Christianity, Islam, and such things. Perhaps not Judaism, but Christianity and Islam certainly, and Hinduism. And these they fulfill their function in that way. But what is interesting to me is that although Christianity certainly began among people who are largely uneducated, it very quickly, because of its seriousness, generated a high culture which was the expression of its own internal values, and growing out of that was, of course, one of the great artistic traditions of our human history. And I think that might be something that should be said, about religions generally, that if they are successful in rooting themselves, they automatically flower in the form of a high culture. It is true, of course, that the high culture can't replace the moral basis of the religion in good works and the shaping of an articulate community. But that is one reason why, obviously, you can't depend upon high culture alone.
And I know your most recent book is about the Church of England. Have you personally made something of a journey back to the Church of England, or is that something that's always been important to you?
Its existence has always been important to me, but yes, certainly I've grown back into membership of it over the years, because it's something that has always been there, I guess, in the background, and it has done nothing to offend me. So going back into it was not at all difficult.
But are you do you believe in God?
Yes.
Oh, right. So have you always believed in God? Because when I read Modern Culture, it sounded like that you saw high culture as a consolation for the loss of faith.
Yes, I think it is for most people of my generation. It always has maintained. It has always been that for me. But I've always had the sense that in the background, the atheist assumptions can't be maintained. That there is something about our relation to reality as a whole which demands a theological account.
And also, you talk about the feeling of transcendence that you experience sometimes.
Yes. Well, those things are very personal, and you can't be generalized for everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'd like to talk now just about this thing you discussed in your essay. The phenomenon of fake intellectuals.
Yes.
Tell me what you mean by that.
Well, I mean people who are pretending to think and taking themselves in, actually thinking that they're thinking when they're not. And I think this is a very well-known phenomenon in the academic world. It's not particularly new, but it escalated during the 1960s in the wake of May 1968, and took over whole areas of the academy, and the humanities in particular.
And you think, a certain thinkers particularly representative? Who are your rogues gallery of fake intellectuals?
I think primarily the great gurus of '68. That's to say, Deleuze and Guattari, Badiou, all those people. Derrida up to a point, although there is something in Derrida which is not totally fraudulent. But I think that they took over the humanities, especially in America, partly because they had the knack of saying totally unintelligible things in the right tone of voice, a tone of critical destruction.
But is it? Do you think that they're still dominating the academy and the humanities, or do you
Well,
think?
actually, I think they are. If you look at the publications, certainly in English studies and all that area, the Deleuze phenomenon has not gone away at all. There are a whole series of books on Deleuze and the cinema, Deleuze and music, etc. My view is that he was a complete fraud, but for that very reason, he provides unintelligible mantras which make you sound important when you reiterate them.
And is that partly, do you think, due to something that perhaps we can applaud, which is the huge expansion of higher education in the 60s, which created far more graduates and postgraduates, but also created a huge market perhaps for this slightly kind of modish, hip type of philosophy?
I think you're right. The expansion of higher education has something to do with it. It certainly produces an appetite for an appetite for words that will make you sound educated when you're not. So it gives a tremendous field of action to the real fraud. Because he's got a lot of people who actually can't understand thinking at all and don't know why they're there in a university, and would actually, if only they could, would rather be somewhere else. And nevertheless, they've got to produce an essay which has the appearance of being a work of scholarship. So they're inevitably vulnerable to this kind of thing.
Mm. But what about Foucault? Because it seems to me you have some respect for his work, though you think he's nonetheless had a bit of a bad influence.
Yes, I mean, he was somebody. For one thing, what distinguishes him from most of them is that he could write. He had, like Sartre, he had that incredible fluency and brilliant ability to produce the appropriate telling image at the appropriate moment. But there's a lot of fabrication there. Certainly historical fabrications have been often exposed, of course, but also there are sort of cheap devices which are a substitute for thinking in his way of approaching things.
Yeah, but the idea, I mean, his core idea, which you criticise, that culture can be read, to use that academic word, as an expression of power relations.
Yeah.
Is that so radical? I mean, when you look back at, say, Plato's Republic, you see him describing different types of culture as, for example, aristocratic culture or oligarchic or democratic. And when you read Matthew Arnold's Culture and Anarchy, he talks about, middle class or Philistine culture and then working class culture. So is it really so kind of radical to do that, or to example, to read Jane Eyre in with reference to the slave economy or something like that?
There's nothing at all wrong with giving sociological accounts of how it is that particular ways of thinking come into being. Marx's theory of ideology, which is the real force behind Foucault, was very fruitful in producing all that in the 19th century. But in Foucault, it's used as a substitute for asking the real question, the question of what do you actually mean, instead of addressing arguments given by others and as though they could be true or false. He always looks for the power that's speaking through what the other is saying. It's like Thrasymachus at the beginning of Plato's Republic. He's defining justice as the interests of the stronger, if you remember.
Yeah.
Saying that's all that justice is. And that's very, if you like, anticipating the Marxist.
And I suppose it fatally ignores the question of quality.
Yes, he ignores the question of truth. Can you really make a distinction between a just and an unjust society if all the concept is the expression of the power of some particular person over another person? Then you can't use it to raise that question.
And just finally, I heard an interesting and fun start the week when you were on with talking to Bernard Henri Levy,
Yes.
and you're talking a bit about the intellectual as a figure in France and as a figure in Britain.
Yes.
And do you think that most of the fake intellectuals you mentioned have been French?
Mm.
Do you think that the French intellectual can get away with this sort of grand posturing in a way that British intellectuals can't? And is a bit of you jealous of that, or
Yes. Well, I'm a great Francophile, and I love the culture of Paris. And for me, I would say that French people very quickly see that these guys are playing games, and you can join in the game or not join in the game. They're not taken seriously in France in the way that they're taken seriously here. And we put them in the same category as Bertrand Russell, or Frege or something, and it all looks rather absurd, I think, to a Frenchman. But you have to remember that although there was this great explosion of, in my view, fake thought coming out of 1968, there has been in post-war France an incredible real intellectual life which we don't hear so much of. There are people like Paul Ricoeur and Alain Besançon and all those people who have kept the spirit of philosophy alive, and serious music has had as much of an innings in France as anywhere else. When you think of Poulenc and Messiaen and de Rufflet and so on, it's all been extremely live since the Second World War, but you don't hear about that. You hear about these frauds instead.
So isn't that then the work of the good critic to focus attention on the great artists who are perhaps toiling away without the publicity skills of lesser artists?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. That it's to see the difference between art and advertising, art and self-advertising. That is the critic's task. But then the even bigger task: persuade the public to see it too.